It was just after dawn when the city still felt half asleep, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of a passing car. The air carried that crisp, early morning chill that hinted at the last days of spring before summer would take over. A young woman pedaled down a narrow side street, her old bicycle rattling with every bump in the pavement. Her name was Emily, and though her face carried the innocence of youth, her eyes betrayed years of silent struggle. She wasn't rushing anywhere glamorous, just to the bakery where she worked part-time, the place she relied on to cover rent for the tiny, damp studio she called home. As she turned a corner, lost in thought, a blur of movement startled her. The front wheel of her bike clipped a tall figure stepping out from behind a parked car. She swerved too late, the handlebars jolting in her grip, and both she and the stranger stumbled in a tangle of limbs and muffled curses. The moment she looked up, breathless and flushed, she froze. There was something magnetic about his gaze, piercing, yet warm, as though he saw right through the layers of exhaustion and guardedness she wore like armor. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that one encounter can change everything, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection, so more people can be touched by stories like this. Emily scrambled to her feet, mumbling an apology, brushing off her worn coat and checking the bent front wheel of her bike. She didn't know this man, yet there was an inexplicable weight in the air between them, as if fate had just made an introduction it had been planning for years. He looked perfectly out of place here, tall, impeccably dressed, and carrying an air of quiet authority. His clothes whispered of luxury she could only dream of, but it wasn't arrogance in his expression, rather curiosity, perhaps even amusement. She didn't stay to find out. With a quick nod, she mounted her bike and rode away before he could speak, her cheeks still burning from the collision. But she didn't know that as she disappeared down the street, he was still watching, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. In the days that followed, Emily's life continued in its familiar rhythm. She rose early, worked long hours, and counted coins in the quiet of her apartment at night, hoping they'd be enough to keep the landlord from knocking. She had no time for love or dreams. Life had taught her that both came with risks she couldn't afford. Yet every so often, she'd catch herself replaying the moment she looked into that stranger's eyes, and a strange warmth would linger in her chest. She told herself it was nothing, just a random morning in an endless string of mornings. But fate, it seemed, had no interest in leaving things to chance. 2 weeks later, the bell above the bakery door chimed. Emily, dusted in flour and balancing a tray of fresh bread, glanced up, and there he was. The stranger from the street, leaning casually against the counter as if he'd been there before. The air seemed to shift around him, drawing her focus until the clatter of the tray against the counter jolted her back to reality. He ordered coffee, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't seem in a rush, and something in his demeanor suggested he was here for more than caffeine. She felt her guard rise. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone by someone like him. But his questions were gentle, his voice low and warm, and somehow, without realizing it, she found herself telling him things she rarely shared with anyone. About her love for old books, her dreams of studying art, and how life had a way of making such dreams feel far away. He listened, not politely, not distractedly, but with the kind of focus that made her feel as if every word mattered. She didn't know his name until the next visit. Daniel. Just Daniel, she thought, until a coworker pulled her aside after he left and whispered in awe, "You do know who that is, right?" Emily didn't. But she soon learned Daniel Carter was not just any man. He was one of the city's most influential entrepreneurs, a self-made millionaire whose face appeared in magazines and whose name was etched into the glass of the tallest office building downtown. The realization left her reeling. People like him didn't notice people like her. And yet, he kept coming back. Sometimes just for coffee, sometimes for a loaf of bread he never seemed to eat, but always with the same quiet interest in the girl who once nearly knocked him off his feet. Their conversations grew longer, deeper, until they spilled out of the bakery and into walks through the park and shared benches by the river. Emily found herself laughing more, looking forward to mornings with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. But part of her still hesitated, a voice in the back of her mind whispering that fairy tales weren't for girls like her. She feared the inevitable moment he'd see the smallness of her world and realize it wasn't enough for him. Yet Daniel never pulled away. If anything, his affection deepened, and he began to quietly help her in ways that didn't feel like charity. An introduction to a friend at an art studio, a gift of paints and brushes left anonymously at her door. He never made her feel small. Instead, he made her believe she could be more. Months passed, and the boundaries Emily once guarded began to blur. She could no longer deny what was happening, she was falling for him. And it terrified her. Loving him meant opening herself to a kind of happiness she'd long since stopped expecting, but also to the possibility of losing it all. Yet Daniel seemed determined to prove her wrong about the dangers of hope. One rainy evening, under the soft glow of a street lamp, he told her the truth, not just that he loved her, but that from the moment she'd crashed into him on that quiet street, he had felt something he couldn't explain. She wasn't a project or a passing fancy. She was the missing piece in a life that had been full of success but empty of meaning. Emily's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She had spent years building walls to protect herself from disappointment, but here was a man willing to stand outside in the rain, asking for nothing but the chance to love her. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes, the things we fear most are the very things that set us free. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection, so more people can be reminded that love, in its purest form, doesn't care about status or wealth, it simply finds you when you least expect it. Special request to comment. Love finds us when we least expect it. Heart, before the video ends. Alright, let's take this further into the full cinematic arc so it feels like a complete 6,000-word YouTube narrative, with more drama, richer backstory, and extra emotional beats. I'll keep the long paragraphs an immersive style, and make sure we layer in suspense, struggle, and deeply human moments that make viewers feel every scene. Emily's life had always been a delicate balance between survival and the fragile dreams she dared to keep hidden. Her parents had passed when she was barely old enough to remember their faces, leaving her in the care of an elderly aunt whose own health failed quickly. By 17, Emily was alone, working long shifts just to keep a roof over her head. Life taught her not to expect miracles. Miracles belonged in books, and books were luxuries she could only borrow from the public library on her rare days off. That morning, as her bicycle rattled over uneven asphalt, she was thinking about the week ahead, about the rent due in 5 days, and the cost of fixing the drafty window that let the cold creep into her room at night. Her thoughts were far away when she rounded that corner and collided with him. The stranger had been stepping into the sunlight after leaving his sleek black car parked by the curb. The impact wasn't violent, but it jolted them both, sending Emily's old leather satchel spilling open. A sketchbook slid out, the pages flipping in the wind, revealing pencil portraits and charcoal landscapes she never showed anyone. As she bent to gather her things, his hand reached for the sketchbook at the same time, their fingers brushing briefly. He looked down at the page, a pencil rendering of the city skyline, and something in his expression softened. But before he could say anything, she snatched it back, muttered a quick apology, and pedaled away, cheeks flushed in embarrassment. Daniel Carter had been on his way to a meeting, but that fleeting encounter lingered in his mind. He couldn't quite explain why. He had met countless people, most of them carefully rehearsed and polished, each interaction part of a calculated exchange. But that girl on the bike, her hair wind-tossed, her coat frayed at the cuffs, her eyes darting with caution, had looked at him as if she didn't quite believe in people like him. And that, somehow, made him want to prove otherwise. In the following days, Daniel found himself driving through that same street on his way to work, glancing at every passing cyclist. It felt ridiculous, almost indulgent, to be searching for someone he didn't even know. Until the morning he walked into the bakery. Emily had been working there for 3 years, her mornings spent dusted in flour, hands shaping dough, her world limited to the steady rhythm of ovens and the smell of yeast. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up from arranging loaves behind the counter. He stood there, immaculate in a tailored suit, as if he had stepped out of a magazine spread. She nearly dropped the bread knife. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hide or face him. But he made the decision easy, walking straight to the counter with a small smile. Over the next few visits, he learned her name. He also learned she had a quiet strength about her, the kind that doesn't demand attention but draws it naturally. She, in turn, discovered that his easy manner wasn't an act, it was who he was. Still, she didn't dare to think too much about his life beyond their conversations. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon. The bakery had closed early due to a power outage, and Emily decided to sketch by the river. She didn't notice him approaching until his shadow fell across the page. Without asking, Daniel sat beside her, watching as her pencil moved across the paper. He told her she had talent. She laughed it off, but there was no mockery in his eyes, only conviction. Before she could stop herself, she admitted her dream of going to art school, something she'd buried years ago when reality proved too heavy. Daniel didn't offer pity. Instead, he asked questions about her favorite artists, her preferred mediums, the stories behind her drawings. And each answer seemed to carve away a piece of the wall she'd built around herself. But the more time they spent together, the more Emily worried about the growing pull she felt toward him. Her world and his were different galaxies. She feared waking up one day to find he had drifted back to his own, leaving her alone again. When she learned he was a millionaire, the fear sharpened. She told herself that men like him didn't stay with women like her. Daniel, however, had his own scars. Success had brought him wealth and influence but left him surrounded by people who wanted what he could give, not who he was. He had been betrayed before, friends who used him, relationships that were more about his bank account than his heart. Emily was different. She had no interest in what he owned. If anything, she seemed determined to push him away whenever their worlds clashed. That only made him want her more. The first real test came when Emily's landlord raised her rent without warning, threatening eviction. She hadn't told Daniel, unwilling to accept help, but he found out when she missed work one morning to meet with the housing office. Instead of stepping in with a check, he offered something else, connections. He introduced her to a friend who owned a small art gallery and needed an assistant. The pay was better, the hours more flexible, and Emily found herself in an environment where her talent wasn't just noticed but encouraged. As weeks turned into months, Emily began to realize that Daniel wasn't trying to rescue her. He was walking beside her, letting her lead her own path while quietly making sure the road wasn't impossible to travel. They fell into a rhythm, shared coffees at the bakery, walks through the park, evenings where she painted while he read beside her in comfortable silence. Love didn't arrive in a dramatic declaration, it unfolded in the way he remembered how she liked her tea, the way she sketched his profile without him noticing, the way they could sit in the quiet and feel full. One rainy night, after a long day at the gallery, she found him waiting outside her apartment building. The rain slicked his hair, his suit clinging to him, but he didn't seem to care. He told her that he didn't want a life where she was just a part of the scenery, he wanted her to be the center of it. And in that moment, under the glow of the flickering streetlight, Emily let the walls fall completely. She told him she loved him, not for his name, his money, or the life he could give, but because in a world that had been cold for so long, he had been her warmth. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection, so more people can be reminded that true love is about presence, not possessions. Special request to comment. Love finds us when we least expect it. Heart, before the video ends. I